Dr. Sukanta Chaudhuri is a senior professor of English, Jodhpur University, where he also heads the School of Cultural Texts and Records. Prior to this, he taught at Presidency College for nearly 2 decades. His fields of academic research are European Renaissance, literature, and textual studies, on which he has published several books and many papers. He has also translated extensively from Bengali to English and is currently the general editor of the Oxford Tagore Translation Series. Professor Chaudhuri is well known for his editorship on Calcutta, the Living City, which was brought out in Calcutta's tercentenary year in 1990. His keynote address on the port, the city, and the world will focus on Kolkata in its role of a port city.
May I begin by very sincerely thanking the Calcutta Port Trust and in particular its chairman, Dr. Chondo, for this very kind invitation to speak here today. I feel a particular sense of privilege because, in fact, my credentials for the role are not entirely obvious, so that also makes me feel slightly apprehensive. Obviously, it would be inappropriate to talk about my subject of specific studies, the literature, the textual studies. I'm here today as an amateur student of urban studies, but basically, I think, just as a common citizen and a stakeholder in the city of Kolkata. I will not be talking about any sort of grand general points of history or policy, but I shall take the worm's eye view in good measure. I shall talk about things that all of us, or at least most of us, maybe with the exception of a few particularly privileged or exclusive people, experiences that we undergo every day, things that we see every day, the circumstances under which we live, but implicit in them are the attitudes of the authorities, the attitudes of the common citizens, and thus ultimately the major trends that do actually shape the present and future of the city as they shaped its past, the entire unfolding history of the city. I'm here, as I said, to speak as a stakeholder in the city of Kolkata, and more particularly in the port city of Kolkata. I'm not an expert on shipping or commerce, on engineering or river management, so I had to look for some way in which, at least to start with, my own particular expertise in languages and literature, such as it is, could afford an entry into my subject. And I found it in the word port. Port, in our present sense, meaning a harbor, harks back to the same remote origin as another word, port, meaning a door or a gateway. They're not quite the same word, but they do have a source somewhere, a common source somewhere in the remote past. And this link between a harbor and a doorway or a gateway also links it to a related word, portal. Portal was an archaic or poetic word in the English language for a door or a gate, but now it has acquired a new context in 21st century information technology. A portal is the gateway through which your computer can access a world of knowledge and activity located in cyberspace. Interestingly, there is also a third word, port, apparently distinct in origin, which actually means a city. So combining these meanings, though etymologically they are not closely related, a port can be said to be a city which is brought into being by its harbor facilities, but it is also a gateway or an entry point into the country. A port is the place where a nation welcomes its visitors and commences its interactions with them. More fundamentally, a port is where a nation decides who or what to let in and what to exclude, what charge to exact for letting something in or out. And by charge, I don't only mean financial charge. How easy or how difficult to make the process. In a word, a port presents the terms on which a country engages with the world and the face it presents to the world. This implies that the nation in question does wish to engage with the world. No nation today is entirely cut off from contact with other nations or can be cut off. But as we know, some countries are more restrictive than others, as regards both the physical entry of foreigners and travel abroad by its own citizens, as regards foreign trade and exchange of information with the rest of the world. Countries that openly follow a very secluded, exclusionist, isolationist policy are getting increasingly rare. But a much larger number, arguably all countries in the world even today, place insidious difficulties of countless sorts to free interaction with the world outside their borders. There is no country in the world that has as yet fully opened its doors to the rest of the world, no matter how many millions of tons of goods pass through their ports every year. What is true of ports is also true of port cities. A port city, by definition, is a city turned outwards to the world, meeting certain worldwide norms of supplies and services, friendliness, and practical support. This does not mean that such a city sacrifices its distinctive character and culture for a faceless uniformity. On the contrary, a port city, and from now on let me exchange this term and say a world city is one that projects a very special personality, but through an internationally attuned infrastructure. A world city presents itself, if you like, markets itself to the world on its own terms. It never prostitutes itself. It simply takes care to ensure that the terms are acceptable to the world. Another important point follows from this. A world city is not one that caters to foreigners at the expense of its own citizens. The tourist resorts in countries like Indonesia, Thailand, or indeed, to our national shame, in the pockets of Goa, where the country's own citizens are formally or informally denied entry, might be dollar-earning foreigners' ghettos, but they mark the sordid reverse of true internationalism. Hence, too, no colonial city could truly be a world city. The most major colonial cities were ports. A chain of such ports garlanded the Indian Ocean from Hong Kong, or in fact still further east from Shanghai, though of course Shanghai, China was never formally a colony, but then from Shanghai, Hong Kong certainly, Macau, all the way westward to Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, Mombasa. Kolkata was almost in the geographical center of this chain of ports lining the Indian Ocean and its inlets and bays. If today some of these cities have become world cities, Singapore, I suppose, being the most outstanding instance, it happened after they had cast off their colonial yoke. The Raj nostalgists, many of them Indians, remarkably enough, who lament the decline of the second city of the empire, as it's still termed, are looking through the wrong end of the telescope. If Kolkata has the potential to be a world city, that potential lies in the future, not the past. But does it have such a potential? The gut response of all too many Kolkatans, as of denizens of every Indian metropolis, not even excepting New Delhi, I think, would be to say no. This is true not only of the common citizen, but perhaps even more of people in positions of privilege and authority, the very people who might have articulated a positive change, but who are too busy flaunting a second-hand internationalism derived from the West to do so. Many years ago, a former chairman of the then Calcutta port, I won't say exactly how many years ago because then you could directly identify the chairman, it was many years ago, that gentleman observed to me about the history and prospects of the port. I quote his very words, past glorious, present dismal, future hopeless. I admired his skill in epigram, but given the recent figures of Kolkata Port's performance, which have just been quoted here today, we can happily conclude that his prophecy was wrong. Yet few of us would generalize on the basis of this outstanding improvement in the performance of Calcutta Port, or Kolkata Port, and the many other such bodies and institutions in Kolkata. Even when we are faced with the figures and the facts, we still hesitate to assert a bright future for the port or for anything else in Kolkata or the city as a whole. Indeed, when visitors from outside observe that the state of the city has improved, we protest that we know better. It has not really. This demoralization is sometimes judged special to Kolkata, but it seems present to some extent in every Indian city. Even residents who are obviously doing well, who are getting more out of the city than they would do elsewhere, keep themselves mentally aloof from their wider surroundings. For the senior civil servant in New Delhi, the swarming tracts beyond the boundaries of the NDMC, the New Delhi Municipal Corporation, might as well be a wilderness. For the young technologists of Bangalore, the Karnataka city surrounding them, which, as we have just learned from the papers this morning, will from the 1st November actually acquire the Karnataka name Bengaluru. But for the young technologists there who have already begun protesting, the city surrounding them might be on a different planet. And I would be curious to know how many of them have ever even made a trip to Mysore. Secure in their mental and professional cocoon, they can either ignore or castigate the city that ensures them a good living, but from which they are psychologically alienated. It may not be an accident that neither Delhi nor Bangalore is a port. The Kolkatan's castigation of his city is qualitatively different, for he is often deeply attached to the place. His strident civic pessimism I would myself put down to a kind of civic indolence. My own impression, obviously, can be nothing more than a general impression by the nature of things that cannot be quantified, but my impression is that the more active and dynamic part of our citizenry think of Kolkata as a place where things are happening, because in their own ways, big or small, they are helping to make them happen. But too many of us, whatever we may say, do not actually want to make them happen. We have too much vested interest in retaining our old ways in the old milieu, in throwing rubbish on the roads, in patronizing pavement hawkers while we complain of encroachment, in boarding buses anywhere and everywhere, in turning up late for work, in delaying projects and fouling up public services by indolence, bribe-taking, and inane paperwork, in illicit transactions with the taxman's complicity, in pleading the shareholders' interest to public detriment in companies where we hold most shares, in raising pollution to genocidal levels in every domestic and industrial activity. There is no innocent party in this game, just as there are no winners, whether in our private identities as citizens or in our public identities as ruler, functionary, manufacturer, trader, or whatever, big or small cog in the wheels that turn what William Blake over 200 years ago called the dark satanic mills of another blighted city, a city of his own times, the city of London. Yet today, London offers its inhabitants a quality of life that we tell ourselves, inwardly if not openly, we cannot reach. But as the very example of London can show us, there is hope for us yet. I seem to have passed into moralizing. Now, none of us likes moralizing, none of us likes being preached at. We are adults after all, even if we act like self-destructive children when we are most worldly wise. So let me shift to a more sophisticated vein, though that means a more ineffectual one if we do not face the crude, disconcerting realities that I've just listed. The collective wrongdoings of which I have given such a depressing list have one thing in common. They all place some narrow or immediate interest over the general good. In the feeble, old-fashioned phrase, they show a lack of civic sense, the understanding required of a civis, the Latin word for a city dweller. A city runs on a vastly complex system of human cooperation, where each individual contributes only a minute fraction of the inputs required for the survival of the entire community. This in turn depends, let us never forget, on a still more complex nationwide, ultimately worldwide system, where the country feeds the city. Cities could come into being only in an era, cities could come into being only in an era of surplus agriculture, when farmers began to grow enough food, not only for themselves, but for the city dwellers who grew none. Presumably, the farmers grew food for the city dwellers in the expectation of benefits in return from the city dwellers, such as protection, planned rule, and ultimately financial and industrial inputs needed for still more productive agriculture. Each of us supports the rest, and because most human beings are humble, faceless, underprivileged, it is that underprivileged majority that by the sheer bulk of their contribution most extensively supports the empowered minority. City life suffers when we forget that it relies on a system of interaction and mutual support among its own inhabitants and between the latter and the outside world. Robinson Crusoe on his island had to fend entirely for himself, but that also meant that he could do exactly what he chose. If we of Kolkata consider ourselves marooned, and I don't only mean during the monsoons, we shall remain confined to primitive, makeshift methods of survival for which the tin and plastic pavement stall and the auto rickshaw turned microbus will be apt and depressing visual symbols. The visual symbols of a true civic order, or what we may call a metropolitan order, are very different. All Indian metro cities are deficient in them to more or less extent. Kolkata still perhaps most of all. This is most glaringly so with respect to road behavior, which is among the most visible aspects of city life. We stop, we park, we cross, we board and take on board, we impede, we pollute more visibly and more brazenly than anywhere else. By a common rule of thumb among urban assessors, the quality of life in a city is reliably indicated by the quality of its traffic movement and public transport. In this respect, we could scarcely hold up a more abject report card. We may be more on a par with other Indian cities in visible dirt and undisposed waste. The Kolkata has less filth lying about than before. But all Indian cities score badly here. Here lies the sadness of our admittedly much improved condition. We have left undone precisely the things which most strike the eye, even of the casual newcomer. Kolkata's water supply is the best among all India's metro cities, despite occasional deficiencies that we complain about. Our power supply, our telecom system might have been transformed. But you might drive up and down Kolkata all day without registering these blessings. I wrong our self-respect by suggesting that the outsider's impression should be the chief criterion. Much more important is, or should be, the insidious effect on us who live here, on our morale, productivity, and well-being. Imagine a Kolkata where everything else remained the same, but traffic rules were observed and enforced. What a miraculous transformation of image there would be. But I am being too restrained in my fantasy. Obviously, everything else would not remain the same. They too would be transformed in consequence. Sadly, this does not seem to hold true in reverse. Much else in the city is being quietly but radically transformed, but with no effect on our road and transport culture, except where a flyover locally and mechanically improves traffic flow, or a hand-operated toy light masquerades as a traffic signal. Indian cities are not user-friendly, and our public institutions still less so. The first trial of an intending patient, actually I should use the word patron, but it came out by a slip of the tongue. We don't think of it that way. The word I actually have written in my copy is patient in a state hospital, or indeed even in many expensive private hospitals, is to find out where to go. This is where the tout first appears in the indispensable role of the facilitator. The same is true of most government offices and a great number of corporate ones, including, truth to tell, if I may be forgiven for mentioning the point here, the Port Trust. I have more than once cleared personal baggage through the Kolkata Port Trust. It was admittedly many years ago. I would like to think that things have changed in the much more dynamic times today. But certainly at that time when I did it, I repeat, many years ago, I found it hard to understand why a process that took a day and could be conducted in my absence in certain other countries should on my home soil take 1 or more weeks, involve 1 or more personal visits, and require payments for which the clearing agent later billed me as incidental expenses. Let me not spare my own professional turf either. Universities have no touts, except where, as quite frequently, students' unions assume that role. But university campuses swarm with visitors trying to locate a department or obtain information. On my own campus, the joke goes on obtaining information on how to locate the information office. So too, the entire city of Kolkata has virtually no street name signs or bus stop signs. Its suburban railway timetable is impossible to obtain. I don't know whether anybody else in this room has ever tried doing so. Changes in bus routes, traffic directives, public tariffs and timings go unannounced, although the same organizations will put large advertisements in the papers announcing various items of publicity. Most amazingly, there is no handy, reliable, decently printed street map let alone a street-by-street guide, even to inner, let alone greater Kolkata. Nor is there a magazine, news sheet, helpline, or website laying out the city sights or cultural events in which we take such pride. If a visitor to the city were to want to know what exhibitions are going on in the city now, or what shows might be held in the evening, what films, what theatres, he would have to rely on the few advertisements and announcements that come out almost accidentally in the newspapers. 100 or more years ago, Kolkata began to see the decline of its riverfront. Turning its back to the world's ships, it chose to look inwards towards its own creeks and marshes. We seem to have repeated the process on the mental and social plane. Here, either you belong and know, or you stand in puzzle when beyond the pale. You know when a road is one way, even if the sign saying so is unspottable. You know when and where a show will be staged because you mix in the right cultural circles. You know when a rally will halt your movements, though the party staging it hasn't told you because it wants you to suffer its might. If you don't know, you don't belong. Worse luck. So I come back to where I set out. A world city caters to the world. It ensures that anyone from anywhere can arrive there and more or less readily negotiate it, use its services, meet its practical needs within it without undue delay, harassment, or exploitation. Such a city might, and almost certainly will, nurture a deeper mystery of spirit, a mystique that eludes one to the end. But this has nothing to do with boorishly withholding its street names and railway timings. Now, some of you may be telling yourself, this man has come back to where he started out in another way too. He set out by censuring those who criticize and dismiss Kolkata, but he has done nothing else himself for the last 15 minutes. It's a fair charge, but an unfair one too, I would argue. The object of my criticism is not to dismiss Kolkata. It is to mark certain factors impeding full growth of a great city, now again in the 21st century, coming into its own after many decades. After the best part of a century, I would say. For the best part of a century, war, riot, famine, and partition had dogged Kolkata. The last event, partition, sparking off, let us never forget, the biggest mass migration in the whole history of humankind. In its train, naturally, came poverty, civic dereliction, and political extremism. A city that has endured this ordeal can accomplish much, and that potential is reasserting itself at last. Sadly, that upswing is most readily apparent in mammoth flyovers and in shopping malls, which, while they undoubtedly indicate kind of prosperity, might at the same time, in another sense, be regarded as obscene. But this upswing also shows more soberly and more hearteningly in a new desire to take on the world, hence a new confidence to adapt to the world, whether or not rightly in any given instance, a readiness to prove oneself by doing something, rather than by claiming a futile and rarefied virtue that could achieve nothing in this bad world. The new readiness to achieve has in its turn led to certain expectations of efficient service, technological advancement, and public accountability. These expectations are, even today, not often met. As I stated earlier, too much of the time, feel it is better not to meet them. Yet more and more of these demands are coming to be met in some measure, or at least to be admitted in principle. We can think of them or even make these demands without being foredoomed to frustration. That is not good enough, of course, but it is something. Given what has been inflicted on us and what we have inflicted on ourselves, it is much. One of the most heartening remarks I have ever heard about Kolkata in recent years was made by a foreigner who knew the city to another foreigner who was visiting it for the first time. He said, "It's just like any other city. You can get around and work and live there same as anywhere else." See, that phrase, "just like any other city," was not dismissive. It was profoundly reassuring. Too long have we asserted our distinctiveness, we are not like any other city, by self-castigation, by inaction, and stoppage of action. The Bengali intellectual, that formidable yet pathetic creature, has proved his worth by voluble abstraction from the realities around him, the realities on which he notionally bases his celebrations. In practical terms, This has meant a suicidal refusal on the part of the Bengali intellectual to engage intellectually with the ground level conditions of city life. And this disengagement on the part of thinking and informed people has allowed much comfort and much channel for escape to our civic administrators, which they should not be able to obtain. Let us moderate the suicidal individuality. At best, such individuality marks the tragic hero, but more often it marks the country yokel who cuts at the branch he sits on. Let us have the humility to admit that we are like other people and other cities. Then and then only might we catch up with the rest or even surpass them. Let me turn again in my tracks so that you may not mistake my meaning. As I said at the outset, to engage with the world is not to lose one's individuality. Rather, one faces the world better if one has the confidence of one's individuality. The world city is always uniquely itself, but it presents itself in a way the rest of the world can access and absorb. If it cannot fully achieve this because of restrictive immigration, hyper-security, high cost of living, non-global language, or even an extreme climate, it is that much less a world city. No city on earth meets world level standards 100%. But what are our special assets for even beginning to meet them? We are an open city. We are indeed culturally parochial in some ways that the Bengali does not realize. But in our day-to-day life, we are almost too admissive of alien practices, impracticable demands, and non-local languages. Sometimes, especially in the English language press and at the high-level consumer market, to the point of offensive, even racist attacks on Bengali culture. Over-tolerance can be a fault, but basically it harbors a great strength and a great practical advantage in our intolerant world. Again, we are exceptionally liberal among Indian cultures as regards caste and community. I think the great sort of broom of the partition swept out that rubbish once and for all. And on the whole, we are also unusually liberal regards gender. The riots that figured annually in my childhood calendar and still do in other metro cities ceased here decades ago. Society. On the one hand, the pressure of population makes such structures even more imperative in Indian cities, because it is the only way so many people can survive in so little space, by disciplined civic structure. On the other hand, the same pressures make it difficult or impossible to find any space at all or to enforce any structure or discipline. As we have recently had occasion to ponder very severely, we have not even begun to work out a fair, viable, and uniform policy to rehabilitate those displaced for urban or industrial development. The car population in Indian cities is increasing much faster, even faster, than the human population. We have made over much space to highways and flyovers, while our public transport languishes, and rapid transit systems, which could move more and more people in a clean and controlled way, remain on the drawing board, if they get that far. We emit little pollution per head compared to the US citizen, but our total output of pollutants is immense, though still small compared to that of the industrial West. In a less manageable sector, Kolkata has set about emulating the retail boom of Delhi, Mumbai, or Bangalore. That this may not be an unmixed blessing shows from the recent course of the curiously named sealing operation in Delhi, of shops being shut down in residential areas where they had been illegally constructed. The very citizens who had been patronizing the shops petitioned to remove them, while the traders profiting from them in collusion with the corrupt administration felt sufficiently alienated from that administration to throw stones at them and be fired at in return. On the whole, residents of rich cities are surely happier than those of poor cities, but there are endless ways to be unhappy, even when one is rich. The heat of demand and competition can soon melt the bonds that keep a city's interactive systems in place, and corrupt conspiracy cannot be an indefinite substitute. The growth path on which Kolkata is set calls for ceaseless vigilance and ceaseless thought. if we are to avoid the errors of our sister cities and preserve the virtues that sustained us in poorer and harder times. The cultural identity of a city consists in more than its art, literature, and cinema. It inheres in the physical and political structures whereby large numbers of humans can survive in a limited space in harmony of body and mind. It involves crucial decisions of large-scale planning, but at the same time, in answer to this question, can such large-scale planning also be scaled down to human-sized bites? Can we have rapid transit systems instead of more flyovers on highways? Or wherever possible, septic tanks and local outfalls instead of long-distance mains drainage? The environment-enhancing East Kolkata wetlands rather than the sewage plant, which when we once tried to install it, promptly broke down? I regard the East Kolkata wetlands, which are still not a living reality in our lives. We have just about learned that they exist, which a generation ago we did not. But we still do not appreciate the miracle that these wetlands represent and their fundamental role in the very survival of the city. I regard the wetlands as a symbol of the special path to growth, civic security, and wealth generation in which Kolkata can, if we so wish, set a unique example to the world. The wetlands form a viable, largely self-contained miniature biospheres. It is low-tech as technology is vulgarly understood, though it applies profound knowledge of physical, chemical, and biological processes. It generates intensive employment. It is protective of the environment. Far from eating up civic funds, it is a productive asset to the local economy. Informed people from all over the world come to see it and study it. Yet the local intellectual still thinks of it as the stinking back of beyond, Dhapar Mart. The administrator and politician who has at last been led, if pressed, to grant its unique value, still do their best to barter it for money and votes. The Eastern Metropolitan Bypass, created in an age less mindful of the environment, began a process of destruction of these wetlands that the proposed Barashat-Raichok Expressway seems set to complete in the supposedly enlightened age of environmental planning. Small is not only beautiful, it might be the only way for the very large to survive. The blue whale lives on minute plankton because there is no other organism plentiful enough for it to feed on. For a behemoth city, building gigantic mega infrastructure is an endless and self-defeating process, as well as an immensely costly one. The more flyovers you build, the more cars you encourage. As we all realize today, vastly more money than necessary was spent on the second Hooghly Bridge, the Bidyasagar Setu, to allow movement of ships which are too large to sail up so far up the Hooghly. By a similar logic, a sensible proposal to build low-cost humps on the VIP road to ease airport traffic was abandoned in favor of an elevated roadway, for which the money has not yet been found, so the traffic jams continue. The more flyovers you build, the more cars you encourage to choke them. The more waste disposal facilities you create, the more waste will be generated to choke them too. If you fill up ponds to build on them, the habitations you create will be sapped by waterlogging. This is what has happened literally, particularly in the later additions to the corporation area to the south of the city. The solution might lie not in terms of flyovers to move so many cars, but rapid transit systems to move so many people. Instead of a gigantic sewerage system, it may be better to think of draining stormwater into local ponds and creeks, or thinking big in a new way of creating more urban wetlands on the East Kolkata model, for which there is ample provision in the wet, swampy terrain of southern Bengal. Such thinking might encourage more local groups to resist the filling up of water bodies, and at least a few more local administrators and politicians to pay such complaints some remote heed. One can think small on a large scale, even large enough to address the civic problems of a megalopolis like Kolkata. The genius of Kolkata has always lain in its ability to think small. This trend has marked our socio-political ideology, often misapplied to our detriment, but basically an immense strength that can be harnessed to the benefit of our city in the only way viable in our economic and demographic situation. Among our current projects at the School of Cultural Texts and Records at Jadavpur University, which I look after, is the recording of eyewitness accounts of the first phase of refugee colonies around Kolkata, especially the pioneering settlement of Bijoygad. Those trenchant and heroic tales of building up what are now flourishing settlements in the teeth of state parsimony and national apathy exemplify what seemed to be the distinctive spirit of Kolkata's development. As so often, it was the people who educated their rulers, not the other way about. This model of development was adopted by the state in later years. In the field of urban planning, a crucial period of civic uplift in the 1970s and 1980s, which again the middle-class Kolkatan acknowledged only in snide jokes about what was then the CMDA. But that crucial period saw precisely this kind of small-scale but extensive grassroots improvement of slums, colonies and suburbs. Kolkata, along with Cairo, set up a new model for developing depressed urban zones along these lines. So also the Kolkata Metro was built by the cut and fill, pick and shovel method, causing great hardship to citizens for many years, but thereby at amazingly low cost, using largely indigenous technology in a way that has attracted the praise of experts across the world. We ourselves are unaware of this praise, as we are largely still unaware of the miracle of the East Kolkata wetlands. Kolkata is a city of many miracles, but they were not miracles worked by acts of God. And we should not now rely on God to take over charge. God has its hands full doing a lot of other things necessary. It is for us to shape our own future, building upon a close and dispassionate view of our present. Thank you.
A.P. Mitra. Dr. A.P. Mitra, although he hardly needs any introduction, he is one of the brightest stars in the scientific firmament of India, an eminent educationist, a personality, a fellow of the Royal Society of London, fellow Indian Academy of Science, and former president, National Academy of Science. Dr. Mitra has many awards to his credit. To name a few: Premchand Roychand Scholar, Calcutta University; Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Memorial Award for Physical Science; C.V. Raman Award of University Grants Commission; Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship; Meghnad Shah Golden Jubilee Award of Indian Association of Science; former Director General CSIR; Secretary to the Government of India, DSIR. Dr. Mitra has more than 200 publications and has written and edited several books and monographs. He is the first Indian to be the president of the URSI. He is a doyen of the upper atmospheric research in India, pioneer in space science. He is well remembered for his publication, Ionospheric Environment. He is a recipient of High National Award Padma Bhushan. He has been associated with the various policy-making national and international bodies. He is presently working as the honorary scientist of eminence at National Physical Laboratory, New Delhi. His present interest is in global change. May I now invite Dr. Mitra.
Professor Sukanta Chaudhuri, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is, of course, a pleasure to be here. But I would like to point out something that I like very much, Dr. Chanda. That is, you introduced this event 3 years back. I did the same kind of thing in the CSIR, in the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, when I became the Director General. For two reasons I did that. We started the Foundation Day, which is 26th of September. The reason was, first, there were several things in areas like the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize, which is India's, we still feel it is India's Nobel Prize, but it was always late. So we said, no, from next 26th September, the announcement will be made for Bhatnagar Prize on that day. and it is now going on in that process. Also, other awards like Young Scientist Award or Technology Awards are given on that day. So having a particular day in an institution has several advantages. You calibrate yourself, you make sure that your timeline is right, you are keeping on to the time frame, and it also brings in different kinds of people to your system. So I think in that sense, it has been a great effort. I also liked very much your concept of a marine archive. I think for many reasons, including some of the works that we do, we'd like to see the progress of Calcutta and the development of Calcutta over a period of time, including the scientific field. So I am very pleased to hear this. My talk is not going to be on the port system because I don't know anything about port, but it will have, what I'm going to talk about will have implications for port system also, direct and indirect, but in a broader frame. And this is, the idea behind it is, the world is changing in both physical, biological, and social sense in a way that has implications for all kinds of efforts. So I'm going to talk about that and what the implications can be for Bengal, for West Bengal. And when I looked at some of the earlier lectures, including today's, what struck me particularly is the history of the Hooghly River Port Complex is really providing you an excellent mirror of how Calcutta and the surrounding region grew over a period of time, including the metropolis. And I noted that the Port Trust, which is 136 years, but in effect it is 300 years. There are several institutions here of science and technology which are more than 100 years. The Calcutta University is 150 years old. Shivpur Engineering College, I understand, is going to complete 150 years very soon. The Jadavpur University is 100 years. National Council. Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, of which I am the president now, is more than 135 years. And this is probably the only institution in the country where on the corridors practicing active Nobel Prize scientist worked, C.V. Raman. And it has kept its excellence over this period of time. Now, these were institutions then of great excellence about the same time. Was there any interaction with the Port Trust or any other organization of that kind? I would like to know. So history of Port Trust, archive, but archive in the context of Calcutta would be of great interest. And why do I need to know that? For many reasons, but one reason is Calcutta was a cradle of scientific and academic knowledge for over 100 years. And one of the things that we are still trying to understand is how did it happen, this renaissance of Bengal in the early 20th century, with Raman, Shah, Bose, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru. How did that happen at that particular time of frame? Can we create it again? What was the, we could in science, philosophy, literature, arts, how did that happen at that particular point of time? That is something, as I said, we are still trying to understand. And in that context, I would like to make some other comment. A few months back, I had an occasion to talk in the Asiatic Society on the miracle year. The miracle year is the 1905, where Einstein published 5 golden papers. But then if you look at it, there was a miracle decade in India, and that was in Calcutta. Miracle decade. And I would like to quote this from Chandrasekhar, the famous astrophysicist, Nobel Prize winner. It is a remarkable thing that in the modern era, before 1910, there were no Indian scientists of international reputation or standing. Between 1920 and 1925, we had suddenly 5 or 6 internationally well-known men. I myself associated this remarkable phenomena with the need for self-expression, which became a dominant motive among the young during the national movement. So that was the period when Raman, Shah, Satyan Bose, all these remarkable works that changed physics happened. Why did it happen during that period? So one has to ask that question, but one might be able to answer that by looking at the history of Calcutta in its broadest sense. But later, in the days when we were students, I was a student of physics, and the chairman, I understand, had an interest in physics. It's very good to know. But then, students of Calcutta was blazing with scientific giants. In our MSc classes in physics, we had people like Satyendranath Bose, Meghnad Shah, and Shishir Kumar Mitra teaching us. All three were fellows of the Royal Society. This is unthinkable now, in Calcutta or anywhere else in India. The excellence, as you all know, declined gradually. Good students and teachers moved to other parts of the country, to Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, to other universities, and to the scientific institutions that began to come up. CSIR, Council of Scientific Research, Atomic Energy Commission, and agricultural institutions, Indian Space Research Organization, defense. Whether this was a good thing or bad thing are matters that people are examining now. There is this outflow from the university system to the research institution, and without any effort of bridging the gap, has produced some bad effects. Students from Bengal, however, excelled in these places, but left institutions in Calcutta weak. Students, I should mention, it is not merely the infrastructure of the universities. They are as attracted to places where they find learning exciting. Teachers are the key. Such teachers they remember all their life. I remember many of these, including a short stint in the Bangladeshi college that I had. Teachers like Ladli Mohan Mitra, teachers like Jagadish Bhattacharya. You'll never forget them. So teachers are the key, but they are not in that number anymore here. But then, I think now there is a resurgence in Bengal in science and technology. Living outside Bengal, but with contacts and essentially fairly intensive contact with many of these institutions, I find a reverse swing. In the last few years, Calcutta has blossomed. I have seen remarkable resurgence of some of the institutions. University of Calcutta, Jadavpur, newly established West Bengal University of Technology, in which I had some role, the Engineering College in Shibpur. But then, in addition, the institutions like Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, the Bose Institute, S.N. Bose Center for Theoretical Physics, Shah Institute for Nuclear Physics, the two CSIR research laboratories, Indian Institute of Chemical Biology and Central Glass and Ceramic Research Institute, are all world-class institutions by any standards, led by very distinguished people. With the abundant talent available here, some untapped and some inadequately tapped, all that I need for Calcutta to lead is a consortium approach, an approach to network. Some source sharing not only of facilities, but of human expertise, having people together. And in addition, you need to have an appetite for daringness. As a scientist, if you want to be really innovative, you have to be daring. And then no innovation is possible without such a daringness that I mentioned. And you need also an integration between science, technology, and services. This region, however, is also changing in other ways, not always positive ways. The habits of conspicuous consumption, so common in Western countries and increasing in other parts of India, was muted in Bengal. Whether this was due to lack of wealth or a result of culture and attitude is difficult to decide. This consumption mania, I call it a mania, has caught up with Calcutta in recent years with disastrous consequences. And some of the consequences, it's too long to mention, but it has an impact on the greenhouse gas system emission scenario and in climate forcing systems. Communication revolution, bringing in conceptual changes in attitude, in value systems, in plans for economic development, has brought in an unfair competition with Tagore's concept of education for personal development. The concept of success has moved towards the concept of personal wealth. Human development, now defined in physical terms, misses parameters like social tolerance, family values, compassion, contentment, peace, a thirst for something that makes life worth living. So we have a problem. Education then itself needs a reorientation. But then there are other things happening all over the world, the changing world. The changing scenario that I mentioned for Calcutta and the surrounding regions is common to all developing world. But it is also, many of these are common to developed world. The key lesson that we have to learn is that regions change, always change. And when the regions change, the whole world changes. There are different aspects of these changes. There are technological changes, political changes, social changes, changes in the state and nature of civilization. Now, how do you integrate this? The key technological change, as everybody knows, is connectivity, the flat earth concept, and the knowledge world. In fact, the President of India, in a lecture recently, in an international assembly that we organized, is a public lecture. His topic was connectivity for 1 billion people. So from his point of view, the connectivity is one of the major things that we can do. But in this knowledge and connectivity world, there are some advantages that India, China, Brazil have. And also in the knowledge world, the information communication technology, modern biology and materials, many of these countries are on equal terms with the USA and Europe. Political changes, however, will manipulate these knowledge scenarios. For even with flat earth, self-interest will dictate class of civilizations. We have now a new paradigm, the role of religion in society and government. And there is another question, the question of the sanctity of nature, the fallacy of the old colonial concept of savagery to civilization, the question of ethics in new science innovations. And there is also an emerging question of what science can learn from culture and culture from science. And second lesson is regions of excellence shift. They are not the same in different parts. And problem areas with all this knowledge world and connectivity do not decrease in number, they go on increasing in number and extent, but they get differently distributed. Change is thus an integral part of the world. This is how life has also evolved. Oxygen, initially absent in the Earth's atmosphere, emerged from life itself. And with it came the blanketing ozone layer, allowing life from the sea to move to the land. For nearly 500,000 years, for which experimental data are available from ice cores, the atmospheric temperature has oscillated from high to low, producing ice ages, but the changes have always been within a set of boundaries. There is always a limit. As if the earth had been controlled by a huge thermostat. But that has changed. The last 20,000 years has been very different. We now see a new kind of change. After the last ice age, as the early humans moved from one region to another and began to form communities, agriculture emerged, catalyzing growth, cementing communities, producing new cultures, but at the same time disturbing the ecosystem. The present world owes its wealth and well-being to human ingenuities, catalyzing industrial revolution. But three main inventions: the steam engine, the Haber-Bosch process for ammonia production, and the chlorofluorocarbons, the wonder molecules for refrigeration, now, in retrospect, have been the most disastrous for humanity. The beginning of what we now call the Anthropocene era, the era when human activities are endangering the earth system. We are having two kinds of changes then, gradual and drastic. The drastic changes are now taking over the gradual ones. There have been catastrophes in the past, destroying civilizations. The damage of Indus Valley civilization is one example. There is a third kind of a change, a gradual one, but monetarically shifting the base level. The kind of change we now see in the world as a result of human innovations, revolutions in communication, genetics, materials. The level is that of shrinking distances, of breaking barriers between sciences and between sciences and humanities. We are beginning to understand the basis of life. We'll perhaps connect with extraterrestrial intelligence soon. We'll produce sensors thinner than human hair. The scene is changing so rapidly that it is impossible to predict what the next century will be like. But the human society doesn't change that fast. Science has the advantage of being universal, independent of nations and regions, has emerged as a new carrier of socialism. Society changes more slowly, has regional and community prejudices that cannot be shut up so easily, and is region, community, and religion dependent. At the same time, its long memory has advantages, carries value concept to future, and encourages diversity. While the earth is getting physically smaller, humanity is not getting united. Separate ethnic groups, dissimilar and sometimes hostile, are proliferating. We are creating hotspots, randomly scattered over the earth, changing with time only in the nature and distribution of these spots. We have thus the curious state of modern civilization, one earth but many societies. What is the future world like? The focus, I believe, will shift from geographical control to resource control. We have now a world fighting for control of oil. Energy security is a dominant control factor. We visualize a shift from energy control, the control of water resources. For this is going to be one of the most scarce and variable resource, particularly under the conditions of climate change. Wars will be fought for water as it is now for oil. Superposed on this will be the problem of global change. For this century, this is the overarching issue, cutting through all human disciplines, technological, social, political, human. Here we are no longer talking about millennia, but of decades, of runaway changes in the earth system, moving into a phase that we call non-analogous. We are witnessing already events of intense storms that we have seen and floods unseasonal weather, landslides, avalanches, dying forests, desertification, melting ice caps, rising sea level. In intensity and magnitude, some are quite unexpected. The Katrina hurricane disaster or the Bombay floods, dense of intense heat that are abruptly descending on different parts of the world, the deteriorated coral reefs, drastic extinction of species are examples of hazards to come. We seem to have moved out of the usual range of variabilities of atmospheric parameters, and random drastic perturbations are occurring in different parts of the world. We are thus entering a new world, human-induced, with no analog in the past, with changes that come through physical, social development, that cut through physical, social, developmental, and political levels. In short, the entire human development process. On the physical side, we have seen new actors in climate forcing system. The old actors are the familiar ones, are the long-lived greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide coming from excessive and often inefficient fuel combustion. Methane from paddy fields and animal, the basis of food security of the developing world. Nitrous oxide from fertilizers. The new actors, not often recognized by governments, come from air pollution, ozone, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, particulates. Energy production is the major culprit. That the driver for economic development is itself a villain. If the production process is inefficient, as in India and many other developing countries, we also produce air pollutants that we now find are climate forcing in regional, even global scales. A third problem that has just emerged is the so-called brown cloud. There is a new international program called Atmospheric Brown Cloud, ABC. Presence of a huge canopy of black carbon, a result of inefficient combustion of coal and oil, and also biomass burning. Rural cooking systems using fuel wood, cow dung, kerosene, charcoal is a major contributor for our human society. It is in a lose-lose situation. Energy is in short supply in India. But then we have, before that, I would like to mention that we have exhausted in a few generations fossil fuel generated over several million years. 50% of mangroves have been removed. Wetlands have shrunk by half. Over 20% of recognized fisheries are already depleted. 50% of land surfaces have been transformed. Now, energy, this major problem, non-conventional energy system is still on the national fringe. Although in solar energy, development started in India long before in many other countries. In fact, it started in my own laboratory, the National Physical Laboratory 50 years back. Biomass burning, which is very common, is producing life-threatening pollutants of a magnitude that is politically explosive. The government, central government, our national government's view that this is a survival emission is ironical, for this emission is life-threatening. Here we encounter complex reactions from both political and social systems. The big emitters of the classical greenhouse gases are the developed countries. With 4% of world population, USA contributes 25% of the entire global emission. Per capita emission of India is only 1/25 of USA, and India's insistence on per capita parity clashes with Western priorities. And so there is not enough space for both groups, both the developed and developing world groups, to go on as usual. For then we soon cross concentration thresholds, beyond which the threat becomes really serious, perhaps even irreversible. The most precious commodity then in the changing world is a stable climate. This in the changing world will be a resource. The question of equity has been raised. Every citizen should in the long run should have an equal emission quota. There is a new concept of contraction and convergence, but I will not go into details of that. But the concept is not just that of climate, which is, as I mentioned, is going to be the main resource, but also a change in the concept, the Western concept of taming of nature. This was quite different from the Indian concept of living with it. But this taming of nature has changed the earth system, as you see, its waters, air, ecosystem, life forms, and in that process, the interacting processes between the different components. The Indo-Gangetic plain, the fruit basket of India, and with the Himalayas, the source of perennial water, has been drastically altered. Several glacial lakes are on the point of bursting, and the Himalayan glaciers are melting at a rate faster than elsewhere, because these are located in the tropical region. The Himalayan river systems draining into the Ganga basin are gradually dying out. Sediment flow is alarming. Water discharges in the Ganga-Brahmaputra Meghna system, providing 43% of cumulative catchment area of all major rivers in the country, has shown a sharp decrease in recent time. India is one of the 12 mega diversity countries, commanding 7% of world's biodiversity, and supports 16 major forest types. This resource is fast depleting. We have a coastline of over 7,500 kilometers, populated by over 10 million people in 9 coastal states, and a high population density sometimes exceeding 450 persons per kilometer square. This long coastline and the extensive exclusive economic zone is a major resource that is going through rapid degradation. What are the implications for India or of Bengal? The future world then is one of drastic changes. But at the same time, it is a knowledge world, but a world of increasing hotspots of ethnic intolerance. It is a complex world, with problems of ethics and morality, of conflict and convergence between science and society, of clash of civilizations, and a tussle for countries trying to dominate resources of energy and water. It will also be a world where the question of environment as a resource will increasingly dominate national ethos. In this changing scenario, can India play a major role? And in the Indian role, can West Bengal may again be an important player? There are two opposing aspects. A role catalyzed to meet the consequences of these changes, that is, we are the receiver of the problems, and a different role in creating these problems. The key issue will be how we develop our knowledge society. President Kalam has identified two important components of such a society: societal transformation and wealth generation. And there are different subcomponents of this. But taking a few examples, as a receiver of problems, as a country where the main sources come from elsewhere globally, but India is one of the countries that, or Bengal is one of the countries which will have the effects of this, impact of this. Global change, we have serious consequences for the Himalayan Indo-Gangetic region. That is why we have taken the Indo-Gangetic plains or the Himalayan region as a target study. This is especially the case for the Ganga-Brahmaputra Meghna Delta. These include heavy sediment flow, a decreasing level of water discharge, increasing occurrences of climate disasters, such as floods, cyclones, and days of heavy rain. Intensity of extreme climatic events is now exceeding the normal range of variability with consequences for Sundarbans, riverine ports, fishermen, abrupt changes in the direction of rivers, of land fertility and landslides in the fragile mountain systems like Darjeeling. Storm surges will increase, and sea level will change the coastal regions. For future planning of riverines and seaports in this region, such changes in sea level, in sea surface temperature, in coastal erosion, in ocean circulation, and intensity or occurrences of storm surges will need to be addressed. This will require a consortium approach of several institutions and several groups working together. The Calcutta Port Trust might, for example, connect with or collaborate with a number of institutions like the Center Coral of IIT Kharagpur or the Ocean Science Center of Jadavpur University. Let us look at the new knowledge world and how it will affect Bengal, West Bengal. There is reason to hope that Bengal will be one of the leaders with its cluster of excellent centers. An abundant talent and the heritage of Tagore and Vidyasagar and the Bengal Renaissance of 20th century. Radio science was pioneered by J.C. Bose and S.K. Mitra many years ago. Nuclear science and technology by Meghnad Shah. Statistics by Manadavish. It is not difficult to visualize a major role for this region in ICT, genetics, materials, intelligent computing. Such excellence also exists elsewhere and sometimes at a better level in some places. To be effective, we'll need, however, to understand several key issues. One is that knowledge is not limited to physical and biological sciences only. One is to add to this societal knowledge. The physical and social sciences will have to merge, as we did during Bengal Renaissance. This will require a change in the educational system. Social science will have to be taught also in sciences and science in social science. Society has to be a beneficiary and also a contributor. If, for example, we wish to introduce ecotourism in the Sundarbans, we need to simulate the effects such a step will introduce. The present controversy between agriculture and industry can be addressed through model simulations of different options. The effect of climate change on the future of Calcutta Port can be simulated. This brings up the question regarding development of mathematics and of modeling. India's early reputation on excellence in mathematics has to be revived. The third is the integration with arts, literature, philosophy, drawing upon the strengths that are already existing.